So hopefully you found that video interesting and engaging. He's definitely, you can see why he's like the most popular speaker at Harvard, and he has he probably doesn't even teach anymore. All he does is speaking engagements because he's a really good speaker. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you got a good perspective on what positive psychology is about, the need for positive psychology, how our brain looks when it's being positive, stuff like that. All right, moving on. Whoops, sorry, it always starts that. Okay, so the short life of emotional ups and downs. So we've talked about some of the negative emotions already. Let's talk about positive emotions, but they're going to be, of course, in contrast to the negative ones, right? What we find is that emotional ups tend to be pretty brief, and emotional downs tend to be pretty brief. Not necessarily brief like surprise, right, which is very brief, but brief in the sense of, for most of us, our moods change. Within the day we have something that makes us feel negative, but by the end of the day we might be feeling more positive. So that's what I mean by the short life of emotional ups and downs. So I thought it would be fun to show you this, the results of this one study by Kramer. Emotional ups and downs tend to balance out. Most of the time our moods rebound. So if you've been feeling negative, you will compensate for that, make yourself feel more positive. Usually if you're feeling positive, you don't try to balance that out. It tends to just naturally wane on its own. Kramer tracked positive and negative emotion words in 100 million status updates of US Facebook users over a 3-year period. This was his first study on Facebook. And if you've ever heard the name Kramer, his name is Adam Kramer, and Facebook, you might be like, this sounds familiar. I'll talk about that in a second. But this was before any of the things that he got sort of criticized for. So all he did was passively track positive and negative emotion words in 100 million status updates of US Facebook users over the course of 3 years. And this is what he mapped out as far as what he saw on different days of the week. Friday and Saturday are the most positive days. So if you look at 0 as like the baseline level, where it's just neutral, it's not positive, it's not negative, it's just neutral. Friday and Saturday are the highest above neutral. Sunday is above neutral also, but Friday and Saturday are the most positive mood days. And then this isn't depicted in the graph, but early morning to midday are the most positive times of the day for people to post. And it kind of makes sense that it would be earlier in the day, and then, at the beginning of the weekend, where people are like looking forward to what might be coming. And so they're optimistic about it, right? So it's Friday and I'm going to have a fun weekend and I'm going to do all these things, or I'm going to see my friends, or I'm going to, I'm going to have positivity on the weekend. So you can see that Friday would probably be the one where you're most likely to post like that. In the morning or to midday, you might be most likely to make the posts about, things that you have planned, or how you've got a lot of optimism about how the day is going to go. So it kind of makes a lot of sense that what he found was that people are most positive as they're sort of like anticipating what's going to be happening. Generally, the duration of emotions is overestimated. We underestimate how resilient we would be in the face of something negative, or how adaptable we would be in the face of something positive, how quickly we would get used to the positivity. That might be one explanation for why people who have less tend to be happier than people who have an excess. People who have a lot of wealth, a lot of opportunity, a lot of money, they may have adapted to what they have, and now they become disgruntled, like if even the smallest thing goes wrong. Whereas a person who has less, they may be showing a lot of resilience and are happier by even smaller things than you would expect. And so we tend to think that we would get stuck in a mood, and that would be our mood, and we would enjoy it for a long time, or we would be sad for a long time. It turns out that's not really how we are. We tend to be resilient and recover from sadness or fear quickly, and we tend to be adaptable, where we get used to whatever degree of happiness we're experiencing. So I'm going to try and underscore that point with a couple of studies. This first one by Reese and colleagues, patients were on dialysis for terminal kidney failure. So terminal means that they are not going to survive this, but we've got kidney failure, so we are undergoing dialysis. And generally in a person whose kidneys have failed, you're going to be going like 3 times a week, and usually you're going to be sitting there for 3 or 4 hours at a time going through dialysis. So they got a group of patients who were in this condition, and they compared them to people who did not have any kind of terminal illness, who, as far as they were aware, were healthy. People who were on dialysis for terminal kidney failure were about as happy as healthy people were. Now, to test this, they had 49 kidney patients undergoing dialysis treatment. They were asked to rate their moods several times a day. They found a matched group of 49 healthy people. So matched group means that they try to match for the sex, the race, the age, try to make all the variables the same except for, the 49 who were undergoing dialysis for kidney failure versus the 49 who were healthy. And they were all asked to rate their moods using a scale from 2, which means very pleasant, to -2, which means very unpleasant. And this is what they found. So we've got, okay, that is the wrong study there. It says winners and controls, and it should say, hold on, I'm looking at something real quick. Okay, so the labeling is wrong, but on the legend, but the but the data is correct. So we've got in the Reese et al. Study, they asked them to look back at how happy they were before. If you were a kidney patient, it was before you found out about your kidney failure. If you were not a kidney patient, you were supposed to be looking back 6 months ago. So that was roughly about the same amount of time for the person to be looking back into the past, and they were supposed to rate how happy they were. The red bars represent the kidney patients, and the orange bars represent the healthy patients. And so if you have them look back to prior to their diagnosis or 6 months ago, depending on your group, you see that, the kidney patients remember being happier before their diagnosis than the non-kidney patients remember being 6 months ago. So there's a difference there where the kidney patients are doing what we like to call Rosy Retrospection. They're looking back at what their life was like before they found out about their diagnosis, and they're remembering it as happier than it really was. Then if you look at the present area, that's where they were doing the several times a day, completing the mood scale in the mood, right? Like at the moment, they would complete the mood scale. And so what you see is really no difference between the kidney patients and the non-kidney patients, right? Their level of happiness, the non-kidney patients are a little less happy, but not significantly different. And then if you look at future, you ask them to look forward 6 months and how do you think you're going to feel? And there's no difference between the kidney patients and the non-kidney patients there. And then if you ask them about mundane pleasure, sort of what they're experiencing during the day and what makes them happy, you see a little less mundane pleasure being taken each day by the kidney patients than you see among the non-kidney patients. So there's a little bit of difference to the negative for the kidney patients when we look at how much pleasure they're taking out of day-to-day events. But everywhere else, the kidney patients are either doing better or the same as the non-kidney patients, which is pretty surprising. You have terminal kidney failure. You're having to undergo dialysis 3 times a week for hours at a stretch, and you are as happy as people who are not in that condition. So it really shows you that we tend to be resilient. We tend to be able to face what we're experiencing. Now, the Brickman et al. Study looked at lottery winners and accident victims, and they were looking to see how long sadness about your victimhood or happiness about your lottery winnings would last. And so to do this for yourself, you could kind of say, assume for the moment that you won $10 million in the lottery today. How happy do you think you would be in 1 year on a scale from 1 to 10? So think about that. Like, how much would you be experiencing more positive affect, more positive involvement in a year after having won $10 million in the lottery versus how you're experiencing those things today? Now assume that you suffered a crippling car accident today that left you a paraplegic. So that means that you are paralyzed from the waist down. How happy do you think you would feel in 1 year on a scale from 1 to 10? So again, think about if that event happened to you, how would that affect your positive affect and your positive involvement a year from now? Well, I can tell you when Brickman et al. Did this study of actual lottery winners who had won a year ago, and they actually studied paraplegics and quadriplegics where they were basically paralyzed from the neck down. They found something a little different from what you would expect given how we tend to feel about it, right? So again, they asked people to look back into their past, and the red bars are the people who won the lottery. The orange bars are just purely controls. They didn't win the lottery. They didn't have a crippling accident. And then the yellow bars are the people who had had the crippling accident. And so if you ask them to look back into their past and think about how happy they were 6 months before the event, in the case of the lottery winners and the paralyzed victims, or in the case of the controls, it was just think 6 months ago. So they weren't looking as far back in the past, probably, if they were controls, because the lottery winners had won at least a year ago. The quadriplegics, paraplegics had their accident at least a year ago. So they're looking a little farther back into the past than the controls probably were. Anyway, what you see is that, yeah, the people who are paralyzed do remember being happier prior to their accident than the people who are controls and looking back in the past. But oddly, the lottery winners remember being happier a year ago, also, before they won the lottery also. So that's kind of interesting, right? That I've won the lottery and I remember being happier before it. Then if we look at their present level, their mood right now, you'll see that the lottery winners and the controls are equally happy. There's really no statistically significant difference between them. The quadriplegics, paraplegics, they did have lower levels of happiness, like distinct, measurably lower levels of happiness in the present. But when they estimate their future happiness, again, you see no difference between the groups at all. And I mean, really, the lower level of happiness that we see in the present for the people who are paralyzed is not like, it's 1 point on a scale from, well, it's really going from -4 to -2 to +2. So it's a scale of 4. They're 1 tick off. I mean, they're really not that different. Like you might expect. You would expect lottery winners to be way happier right now, and paralyzed people to be much less happy now. But what you're seeing is a lot of very much similarity. And as they project themselves into the future, you see the same amount of happiness projected. They expect to be the same amount of happiness as each other. Like there's no difference between groups. And then finally on mundane pleasure, it's actually kind of dropped for the lottery winners. They're experiencing less mundane pleasure than the controls are. Again, not that, dramatic, but it's about 1 point, maybe 0.75. And so the lottery winners are experiencing less mundane pleasure. Mundane pleasure is, just taking pleasure in little simple things that happen during the day. So it kind of implies that winning the lottery might rob you a little bit of pleasure, even to the same extent almost than people who have had a crippling accident. So we overestimate what impact different kinds of events will have on our happiness or our sadness or like that. We overestimate that, and we underestimate how adaptive we are. That we'll get used to now being $10 million lottery winners. And so the little things in life are just not as good as they were before we won the lottery. Now we don't appreciate those little things anymore. And so we don't get happiness out of small things. And so it sounds like a great thing to win $10 million, but it might not be the greatest thing. It sounds like the worst thing to become paralyzed, but it might not be as dramatically harmful to your mental state as, we think it might be. And so we overestimate, how transitory our happiness would be, and we underestimate how resilient we would be. All right, I'm going to let you go in the playlist onto Dan Gilbert. He's going to talk a little bit about some of these same studies, and he's going to talk a little bit about, impact bias, which is a really important factor in how happy we might be feeling at any given moment. So I'll see you on the other side of that.